I remember the day when an elderly man dressed in threadbare clothes and carrying a battered canvas bag slowly walked into a Chase Bank in downtown Rockview. His name was Malcolm Johnson, and even though his appearance betrayed decades of hardship and neglect, his eyes burned with a quiet determination that no amount of ridicule could ever extinguish. In a voice that was soft yet unwavering, he calmly announced, "This bank is mine." At that very moment, the polished marble floors and high-ceilinged lobby, usually filled with the chatter of well-to-do customers, fell into a stunned silence before a wave of mocking laughter swept over him. The snickers and derisive comments were not merely a reaction to an oddity, but a manifestation of a deep-seated prejudice that had been ingrained over generations. The white patrons, clad in their meticulously tailored suits and designer accessories, exchanged whispered jibes as they clutched their purses and adjusted their expensive jewelry. A middle-aged woman, her perfectly coiffed hair and elegant attire a symbol of a life of privilege, tightened her grip on her purse as if to shield herself from the man whose very presence challenged the established order. Meanwhile, a young bank employee couldn't help but smirk and murmur to his colleague that Malcolm must have wandered in by mistake. Yet Malcolm paid no heed to the sneers or the condescending remarks. Each deliberate step he took toward the center of the lobby was measured and purposeful, as if he were reclaiming not just a building, but a part of his very soul. It wasn't long before Stephen Miller, a tall security guard in a crisp uniform with a perpetually furrowed brow, stepped forward. Known for his aggressive demeanor and an unyielding belief in his own authority, Stephen's eyes gleamed with disdain as he eyed Malcolm. "Hey, old man," he barked in a tone that was both patronizing and threatening. "This isn't a place for you to cause trouble. You'd better leave before I have to get physical." His hand hovered near the holster of his gun, a silent yet menacing warning that underscored the contempt with which he regarded Malcolm. Yet, instead of trembling, Malcolm simply turned his gaze towards Stephen, his expression remaining calm and resolute. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he replied, his voice echoing throughout the lobby like a solemn promise. "I'm here to reclaim what was taken from me more than half a century ago." The bank manager, James Temp, a well-groomed white man with neatly combed blonde hair and cold, light blue eyes, had been watching the unfolding drama with a mixture of irritation and disbelief. Although he tried to maintain an air of professionalism, his voice betrayed a hint of arrogance as he interjected, "Sir, I'm not sure what you think, but you're mistaken. This bank has been owned by the Matthews family for decades, a legacy that dates back to my grandfather's time." His words, meant to reassure his clientele, instead added fuel to the fire of an already charged atmosphere. Malcolm's response was measured but firm. Slowly he set his worn canvas bag on the marble floor and carefully produced a faded yellow ledger from within. "I will show you," he declared, his voice rising with the weight of truth. "This is the ledger of Chase Bank from 1948, the very year I founded this institution. I am Malcolm Johnson, and I am the rightful owner of this bank, taken from me by greed and racial hatred." At that moment, the room was enveloped in a heavy silence as the ledger's revelations sank in. The laughter, the whispers, and the scoffs that had filled the space now gave way to stunned shock and a creeping sense of dread among those who had so long taken their dominance for granted. Even Stephen's aggressive stance wavered for a brief second as doubt flickered in his eyes and the bank manager's face paled with uncertainty. What the onlookers had dismissed as the ramblings of a feeble old man was transforming into a powerful declaration of injustice and retribution. The ledger, yellowed with age and bearing the indelible marks of history, was more than just a relic. It was Malcolm's battle cry against a system that had ridiculed and oppressed him for far too long. I can tell you, dear listener, that in that charged moment, it became painfully clear that Malcolm's quiet determination was the calm before a storm born of decades of racial discrimination and personal suffering, a storm that promised not only to expose the cruelty of those who had scorned him, but also to exact a revenge so monumental that it would leave his oppressors reeling. As the ledger lay open on the floor, its secrets poised to shatter the very foundations of the bank's hallowed halls, the seeds of a counter-attack were sown. A counter-strike that would transform humiliation into a triumphant reclaiming of dignity. The truth, as Malcolm had shown, was unyielding, and the legacy of injustice was about to be met with a response so fierce that even the most hardened hearts would pause to listen in awe. I remember that fateful day when Malcolm Johnson, a humble yet unyielding elder with a lifetime of scars etched on his face, stood before the haughty elite of Chase Bank, his eyes burning with a fire that defied every sneer and every whispered insult. As the murmurs of disbelief faded into an oppressive silence, even Stephen Miller, the once overconfident security guard whose hand had rested threateningly on his gun belt, took a hesitant half-step back. In that instant, it became evident that Malcolm was not merely a feeble wanderer, but a man whose quiet determination was shaking the very pillars of their arrogance. I could see the smug certainty on Stephen's face crumble into uncertainty, his grip loosening as he realized that the frail figure before him carried an undeniable truth that none of the bank's polished decorum could ever mask. In that charged moment, Malcolm held the yellowed ledger aloft like a banner of retribution, his steady, weathered gaze locked with that of James Temp, the bank manager whose once impeccable composure was now being eroded by the shock of witnessing a past he had long denied. The atmosphere in the lobby shifted dramatically. The derisive glances and mocking laughter that had filled the room were replaced by a suffocating tension and palpable unease. Every eye, from the disbelieving bank employees to the affluent patrons clutching their designer purses, fixated on the old canvas bag that Malcolm gently set down on the gleaming marble floor. The sound of that bag touching the floor echoed through the space like a prelude to an irreversible change, leaving everyone frozen, hearts pounding in a mix of awe and apprehension. Slowly, with deliberate and measured movements that belied his age, Malcolm reached for the frayed string of the bag. His gnarled, wrinkled hands, hardened by years of struggle and injustice, untied the knot as if unfastening the chains of a past burdened by racial prejudice. With a quiet resolve, he opened the bag to reveal stacks of faded, brittle money, bundles of old cash marked with the worn logo of Chase Bank, a symbol that had not seen the light of day for more than half a century. The ancient bills, yellowed with time and touched by the echoes of history, spilled out onto the cold marble floor, scattering like relics from a bygone era. The sight sent a shiver down the spines of everyone present. Even Stephen's eyes widened in shock, and Temp's face turned a ghastly shade of white as he hesitantly picked up one of the bundles. A hushed murmur rippled through the crowd as Temp, his voice quivering with disbelief, whispered, "It can't be." The question hung in the air, laden with incredulity and dread, while Malcolm's calm, clear voice filled the void. With a measured tone that resonated with every ounce of his hard-earned dignity, he began to recount his past. He spoke of a time when, in 1948, he had built this very bank with his own hands, brick by brick, pouring his sweat, tears, and heart into a dream that was ruthlessly shattered by racial hatred. Malcolm revealed that every dollar, every stone in that grand edifice carried his indelible mark of hope and determination. Yet, because of the color of his skin, greed and prejudice conspired against him. His once trusted business partner, John Williams, unable to accept that a black man could lead and own a thriving bank, had betrayed him in the cruelest manner imaginable. Williams had colluded with powerful figures, forged deceitful documents, and spread malicious lies, all to wrest control of the bank from Malcolm's rightful hands. As Malcolm's words spilled out, raw and unyielding, the atmosphere in the bank grew heavier with remorse and anger. Temp's authoritative facade began to crumble under the weight of undeniable evidence, his trembling fingers running over the faded inscriptions in Malcolm's ledger. Every page of that ancient book was a testament to a dark chapter of systemic injustice, a story that had been buried under layers of racial prejudice and corporate greed. The once confident Stephen Miller, now stripped of his bravado, looked on in dismay, his eyes searching Temp's for guidance as his own certainty faltered. In that moment, every individual present felt the sting of shame and the awakening of suppressed truths. It was as if the very foundation of Chase Bank was quivering under the weight of decades of neglect and deliberate erasure. Malcolm's declaration was not just a demand for justice. It was a promise of a reckoning so magnificent and inevitable that it would leave every doubter stunned. His voice, imbued with a lifetime of sorrow and resilience, declared, "I am Malcolm Johnson, the man who built this bank with my own hands, only to have it stolen from me by the vile forces of racism and greed. Now, I am here to take back what is rightfully mine." With those words, the seeds of a monumental retribution were sown in that hallowed hall. As the ancient money lay scattered before him, each bill a silent witness to a past of exploitation, Malcolm stood as a beacon of defiance and unyielding spirit, a man ready to reclaim his legacy and restore the honor that had been denied him for far too long. I remember that moment when Malcolm Johnson stood before the stunned crowd, his eyes glistening with the fire of a man who had been wronged for far too long. Even as James Temp's hands trembled uncontrollably while clutching the yellowed papers, the evidence of a stolen legacy, Malcolm's voice remained steady and commanding. He had taken back the power that had been ripped away from him over 50 long years, and now the truth was beginning to speak with a force that no one in that grand, marble-floored lobby could ignore. The old bank, a symbol of wealth and old money in Rockview, suddenly felt the weight of a secret that had been buried under greed and racial prejudice for decades. Malcolm's gaze swept the room with a mixture of sorrow and defiance. He looked out the large bank window, as if recalling each painful memory with vivid clarity. A time when he, along with his once trusted partner John Williams, had built this very institution with sweat, tears, and dreams, measured in American dollars. Back then, in 1948, the promise of a fair society was still alive, even if the world was filled with barriers for a black man like him. But as he recounted his story, his voice wavered between soft reminiscence and the hardened edge of a man who had seen betrayal at every turn. He spoke of a time when his unyielding hope was crushed by those who cared only for power. Malcolm recalled how John Williams, the man he had once believed in unconditionally, had succumbed to greed and bigotry. Williams had conspired with powerful white shareholders, twisting the law and their own prejudices to drive Malcolm out of the very project he had poured his heart into. "They told me a black man could never run a bank, that my very existence would tarnish their precious reputation," Malcolm said with a pained intensity that cut through the thick silence of the lobby. The murmurs among the onlookers grew louder, some filled with sympathy, others with a guilty shame as they realized the cruelty of a past they had long ignored. Even Stephen Miller, the security guard who had earlier worn a mask of contempt, now stood quiet and diminished, his earlier bravado melting away as he listened to Malcolm's tale. His eyes darted uncertainly between the trembling James Temp and the resolute figure before him, knowing deep down that the rigid order he had so proudly defended was built on injustice. "I went from one courtroom to another, pleading for justice, only to be met with cold indifference or outright mockery," Malcolm continued, his voice rising with every painful memory. "I remember one judge looking me square in the eyes and saying, 'You should know your place.' The statement, harsh and unforgiving, sent shivers through those present, forcing even the most privileged to confront their own complicity in a system steeped in discrimination. In that charged atmosphere, Malcolm's words were like a clarion call. He explained how every brick of Chase Bank had been laid with his own two hands, every dollar of the institution's legacy marked by his sacrifice. Yet, as the evidence of his rightful claim, those original legal documents, preserved in oilskin and painstakingly maintained, was laid bare for all to see, the room erupted with a mix of disbelief and dawning horror. The documents were not just paper. They were the final, undeniable proof that the Matthews family and John Williams had conspired to steal not only a bank, but the dignity of a man who had given everything to build it. James Temp, now forced to face the shattering truth, sank slowly into a chair. His face, once filled with arrogant certainty, was now ashen and void of any pretense of control. He fumbled with the stack of papers Malcolm had so deliberately placed into his trembling hands, each page a testament to a past that had been manipulated by racism and greed. "If these papers are real," Temp whispered, his voice barely audible, "then it means that Chase Bank was unlawfully seized from you." Malcolm's eyes burned with a mix of sorrow and righteous fury as he stepped closer, his voice resonating through the now hushed room. "Yes, I am Malcolm Johnson, the man who built this bank from the ground up. I poured every ounce of my heart and soul into this dream, only to have it stolen by those who believed that my skin was a mark of inferiority. Today, I stand not for petty revenge, but to reclaim the honor that is rightfully mine." His declaration was both an accusation and a promise that the long-hidden truths of racial injustice would no longer be suppressed. The room was filled with a palpable tension as the affluent patrons, the bank staff, and even the silent observers on their phones felt the enormity of the moment. It was as if time itself had halted, each person forced to confront the injustice that had been hidden behind the polished facade of wealth and power. In that instant, Malcolm Johnson was not just an old man in poverty. He was a symbol of resistance, a living testament to the idea that no matter how deep the roots of discrimination, the truth will eventually rise, demanding recognition and respect. In the aftermath of Malcolm Johnson's earth-shaking revelation, the entire Chase Bank lobby descended into a state of hushed chaos, as if the very air had thickened with the weight of a long-hidden secret. The faded legal documents lay open in trembling hands, while the customers exchanged nervous glances and whispered among themselves, their voices soft yet charged with disbelief. Many reached for their smartphones, intent on recording the moment, while others edged toward the exits, unsure whether to flee from the scandal unfolding before their eyes or to bear witness to a truth that had been suppressed for more than 50 years. In the midst of this maelstrom, Stephen Miller, the imposing white security guard known for his unyielding hostility, suddenly reclaimed his aggressive stance. His face flushed with anger and confusion, he gripped the gun holster at his side as if trying to summon a fading authority. His eyes burned with resentment as he glared at Malcolm, convinced that the old man's evidence was nothing more than a desperate scam meant to disrupt the bank's order. "Enough," Stephen bellowed, his voice echoing through the vaulted lobby and piercing the tense silence. "This old man is clearly causing trouble, and all that evidence is fake. I won't let him continue to make a scene here. Someone call the police right now." His booming words only deepened the already palpable tension, forcing many to recoil in fear, while others clutched their belongings as if to hold on to a semblance of safety. Yet Malcolm, with the calm of one who has endured decades of injustice, met Stephen's aggression with compassionate, unwavering eyes that held the sorrow and strength of a man who had suffered too much to be silenced now. "Mr. Miller," Malcolm said gently but firmly, his voice carrying the weight of years spent battling discrimination, "I am not here to cause trouble. I am here to bring the truth to light. Do you really believe it is right to hide a crime that has festered for over 50 years? For a brief moment, Stephen's aggressive mask faltered, his grip on the holster tightening, as if trying to suppress the doubts swirling in his mind. He scanned the lobby, seeking allies in the sea of skeptical and anxious faces, but found none, only confused and hesitant looks that deepened his fury. "I don't know what you're talking about, and I don't care," he snapped harshly, his tone challenging and cold. "You have turned everything upside down here, and you're going to answer for it. Sit still until the police arrive." At that moment, James Temp, the bank manager whose once assured demeanor had crumbled into pale confusion, slowly rose from behind the counter, clutching the yellowed documents. With trembling hands, he stepped forward towards Stephen, his voice weak as he attempted to salvage order in a situation spiraling beyond control. "Stephen, wait. We need to stay calm. We should examine these documents carefully before taking any drastic action. This is not as simple as you think." But Stephen, his eyes blazing with indignation, shot back. "What are you talking about, James? Are you really going to believe the lies of an old man who is trying to ruin the reputation of our bank and jeopardize the jobs and lives of everyone here?" His words cut through the lobby like a whip, leaving James momentarily speechless while the customers edged further toward the exits. Yet Malcolm stood unmoved by the storm of anger and doubt, his gaze fixed on Stephen as if daring him to let power and prejudice silence the truth. The silence that followed was thick with apprehension and the growing realization that the cherished legacy of Chase Bank was now under siege. Every eye in the room was drawn to James Temp, whose conflicted expression revealed the dawning awareness that the documents he held were not mere pieces of paper, but irrefutable proof of a grievous historical injustice. The authenticity of each faded signature spoke of a time when Malcolm had built this institution with his own hands, only to have it stolen by the ruthless collusion of greed and racial hatred. As the murmurs of the crowd swelled into a tidal wave of uncertainty, the shadow of the powerful Matthews family loomed large. They had long ruled over Chase Bank and the town of Rockview with an iron grip, their wealth and influence built on a foundation of lies. James Temp, caught between his duty and his conscience, felt the pressure of an impending legal battle that could shatter not only the bank's legacy, but his own life. The room grew quieter still, every breath laden with the tension of a moment when history and justice collided. It was then that Emily Carter, the youngest employee at the bank, emerged from behind the counter. Known for her quiet diligence and cautious nature, she could no longer stand idly by as the truth unfolded. With deliberate steps, she walked toward the scattered remnants of faded money on the gleaming marble floor, her determined gaze a beacon of hope amid the overwhelming uncertainty. Her quiet act of defiance resonated with the customers, some of whom began to look upon Malcolm with deep sympathy and a renewed belief in the power of truth. In that moment, as the echoes of Stephen's threats and the fearful whispers of the crowd mingled with the steady cadence of Malcolm's impassioned plea, it became clear that the struggle for justice was far from over. The stage was now set for a reckoning that would force the legacy of Chase Bank and the prejudices that had defined it for generations to face the uncompromising light of truth. I remember the moment when Emily Carter, the gentle yet determined young bank clerk, stepped out from behind the counter and moved toward Charles Montgomery with a worn-out chase bill clutched in her trembling hand. The faded emblem on the bill, though nearly illegible, carried a weight of history that spoke of decades of hidden injustice. With quiet resolve, she placed the bill on the polished table in front of Charles, her eyes filled with a silent declaration of trust. "I trust you, Mr. Montgomery," she said, her voice soft yet clear, echoing across the vast lobby. In that instant, it felt as though the oppressive veil of lies and prejudice that had haunted this institution for over 50 years was beginning to lift. Almost immediately, the atmosphere in the bank shifted. One by one, other young employees stepped forward. Josh, a previously aloof staffer, hesitantly picked up another weathered bill and placed it next to Emily's offering. His face flushed with embarrassment as he muttered, "I trust you too, Mr. Montgomery. I'm sorry for the disrespect earlier." The quiet acts of defiance and solidarity rippled through the room, drawing even the most silent witnesses into a collective moment of truth. Each bill laid on that table was more than paper. It was a testament to a lifetime of suppressed injustice, a small but powerful gesture challenging the decades-old tyranny of the Matthews family's rule over Chase Bank. As the employees joined in, a quiet revolution stirred. Their unified act of placing the faded bills on the table was a direct affront to the cruel forces of discrimination and greed. But not everyone in the room shared this newfound courage. Stephen Miller, the tall, muscular security guard known for his aggressive stance and unyielding belief in the old order, watched the scene with eyes widened in fury and disbelief. To him, the sight of these young people honoring Charles Montgomery felt like a betrayal of everything he had sworn to protect. His hand tightened around his gun holster, and his face flushed with a mix of anger and panic as the realization struck him that the power he had always relied on was slipping away. "Are you all insane?" Stephen bellowed, his voice reverberating off the marble walls and sending a chill through the crowd. His words cut through the charged silence like a whip, igniting a spark of terror in those who still clung to the remnants of the old regime. Yet, even as Stephen's threat hung heavily in the air, Charles Montgomery stood resolute. His calm, dignified gaze met Stephen's, conveying a lifetime of suffering and an unbreakable spirit forged through years of injustice. "Mr. Miller," Charles replied steadily, his voice carrying the weight of truth and a sorrow that resonated with every listener, "I am not here to cause trouble. I am here to bring the truth to light and to reclaim the justice that has been stolen from me and so many others." At that moment, as the tension in the lobby reached a fever pitch, every eye in the room focused on the trembling gun in Stephen's hand. The silent courage of the young employees and the unwavering resolve of Charles Montgomery had sown seeds of a new era, one where the legacy of racism and corruption would no longer be hidden. The very foundations of Chase Bank, once built on a lie, were now trembling under the force of truth, and the promise of a long-awaited reckoning. I remember that charged afternoon when Henry Langston, a dignified elder whose life had been marked by struggle and relentless injustice, stood firm in the heart of Chase Bank, while older employees nodded in quiet support, their eyes burning with resolve and confidence. In that moment, everyone understood that they were standing on the threshold of the most difficult legal battle in the bank's history, a battle that would not only expose decades of racism and corruption, but would also force the powerful Matthews family to face the consequences of their greed. Across the room, Stephen Miller, the once intimidating security guard who had always prided himself on maintaining order at all costs, now wore a thoughtful silence. His gaze, which had blazed with anger and contempt moments earlier, now revealed hints of doubt as he began to realize that the fight he thought was about preserving authority was, in truth, a fight to protect lies and long-hidden injustice. The next day, with determination in his step, James Temp entered the Chase Bank executive meeting room carrying a trove of evidence, a collection of legal documents, ancient banknotes, and the original ledger that had been hidden away for decades. Standing before the entire leadership, including the proud and imperious members of the Matthews family, James laid bare the explosive truth without a hint of hesitation. His voice, steady and unwavering despite the sharp, angry glares from his superiors, declared that the bank's history was tainted by a theft that had robbed Henry Langston of not only his legacy, but also his dignity. The executive board's reaction was as James had anticipated. Fierce anger, vehement denial, and veiled threats filled the room. Yet James stood firm, fully prepared for the legal battle that lay ahead. Not just to defend Henry Langston, but to salvage the very soul and honor of Chase Bank. As the truth spread like wildfire throughout the town of Rockview, Henry Langston's story became a rallying cry for justice. The local press, hungry for a scandal that exposed the rot at the heart of the bank, began an in-depth investigation into a series of past wrongdoings that the Matthews family had desperately tried to conceal. Soon, every citizen in Rockview was talking about the once-forgotten founder who had built the bank with his own two hands, only to have it usurped through racist schemes and ruthless greed. The legal battle that ensued captured the community's full attention and transformed Henry Langston into a living symbol of the fight for truth, inspiring many who had long suffered under systemic injustice to stand up and demand change. In the days that followed, employees like James Temp, Emily Carter, and Josh, along with several older staff members, united behind Henry Langston's cause. They believed that no matter how long the fight, truth and justice would ultimately triumph over the forces of power and money. Their support was not just a show of solidarity, it was a rebuke to the oppressive system that had long marginalized those who dared to speak out. Even Stephen Miller, whose rigid belief in the old order had begun to crumble, could no longer ignore the overwhelming evidence of injustice. The realization that his efforts were now protecting a web of deceit rather than upholding true order slowly took root in his mind, leaving him conflicted and increasingly isolated. That fateful day marked a turning point. The Chase Bank lobby, once a bastion of quiet entitlement, had become a battleground where courage met cruelty and the power of truth began to dismantle the legacy of racism. Henry Langston, whose life had been a long, painful struggle for recognition and justice, now stood at the center of a movement that promised to rewrite the bank's history. The legal proceedings that followed were grueling and intense, yet they were driven by the unyielding conviction of those who had finally decided to stand against the injustices of the past. The Matthews family, who had ruled with an iron fist for generations, faced the wrath of a community no longer willing to accept their exploitation. In the end, the story of Henry Langston was more than a personal quest for retribution. It was a profound lesson in courage, perseverance, and the transformative power of truth. His fight, which began as a solitary battle against prejudice, had evolved into a movement that challenged deeply rooted power structures. For those who had spent decades watching power and prejudice triumph over decency, Henry Langston's journey offered a beacon of hope. It reminded everyone that even when history is twisted by greed and racism, the light of truth will always find a way to shine through. If his story moves you as it has moved countless others, Share it widely with your friends and family, for in doing so you join a movement that believes justice is not a distant dream, but a right that every person deserves.